Good news for Ryan Blaney as we begin our podcast here. It's Wednesday, a couple of days later than normal. We're talking NASCAR, Chris Graham, Rod Mullins, and yeah, Ryan Blaney. He's been known to run out of gas as he leads late in races at least once this year. Hate to harp on that, but he did do that and run out of gas before the finish line. But this week, Rod, he got the reassuring call over the radio with 10 laps to go. He said after the race he didn't remember getting this call, but his crew chief told him, "Hey Ryan, you're okay on gas." So, and he was. Turned out he
Yeah.
was. The math was right. But Ryan Blaney gets to win in Iowa this past weekend. Hey, I wasn't too far away. I didn't pay attention to this, but I wasn't too far away when I was out in Omaha. I maybe could have driven over there and caught some of this race.
Yeah, you could have covered some of the race and stuff. It would have been a fun race too, especially this being the first race at Iowa for, NASCAR for the Cup Series, at least visiting there and so forth. So it was a great debut for them where they went to Iowa and, I think a lot of people were kind of expecting them to maybe play on the thing of, if you build it, they will come and so forth. And this Iowa thing has been around, this track has been around for quite a while. And it has hosted some truck races. It's hosted Xfinity Series races. It's even hosted Indy Cup races. This was designed by Rusty Wallace. And when Rusty Wallace designed this track, I was telling my wife the other night while we were watching the race, I told her, I said, look at it. I said, it takes on a resemblance of a different track almost at different points looking at it on TV. Now, of course, TV kind of takes away from it. You don't get as much of the angle like you do at Bristol. It's high banks and so forth. But when Rusty Wallace was helping design this track, he put a little bit of high banks in it, put a little bit of some, curve in it, put a little bit of an incline in it in the front and the back stretch, put a dog leg in it, made this made this over a 3/4 mile track, but still, what can you say? It was a great debut, I think, for NASCAR for the Cup Series. And I think they were sold out also. This was one of the races when they first announced that Iowa was going to host a Cup Series race. The tickets went like mad. And so they sold out. It was a great weekend all in all. And Ryan Blaney comes away with a win. And I'm like you, there wasn't any kind of unpleasant surprise waiting on Ryan Blaney here toward the end of the race as he got ready and he finished everything off. And I think it was just for him, it was just a great pickup from where he had been here a couple of weeks ago.
When I was out there in Omaha for the World Series this past weekend, and the local media out there, the TV and the local papers were excited about the NASCAR as well
Mhm.
because I know we're both in Virginia, so we're both in the South, and grew up with racing in our part of the world. But the folks out there, Midwest has a great racing tradition too. And you mentioned that if they build it, it will come. They will come. Kind of aspect to this, this track was built with the idea in mind. Let's lure NASCAR here, and if
Mhm.
finally they get them in 2024. But the folks out there have been looking forward to this for so long. The racing fans out there are looking forward to this race finally coming to their part of the world for so long. I don't know that. I guess those of us who are Southern racing fans, we
Mhm.
don't think of Midwest. We don't think of Iowa as
Yeah.
a racing hotbed. But the folks out there think of themselves as a racing hotbed. They have their dirt tracks and their tracks all over the state, all over the Midwest. And so for them, this was the Super Bowl of racing for them.
Yeah, and you talk about some of the great drivers from the Midwest. I mentioned Rusty Wallace, Ken Schrader, also he's a Midwestern driver. Kenny Wallace, we call him Herman on the circuit, even though he's ran the Cup circuit, and he's got a very popular video podcast on YouTube right now. He ran the Cup Series, Xfinity Series for a long time. I can't go without mentioning Dick Trickle more than anything else because Dick Trickle came from, if I'm not mistaken, Wisconsin.
That's right.
That's close to Midwest, but still it's north. But he raced anything and everything that he possibly could in the Midwest. And then when he had ran all he could possibly go, it's time to go for the big dogs and go to South and see what he could do in the South. Dick Trickle left a lasting legacy in NASCAR. I mean, he did things the opposite way. And to me, I think that's what makes these Midwest drivers a little bit more unique than some of the Southern drivers. We see Southern drivers and so forth, and their kind of ways about the way they drive, the way they do things, and so forth. But here, Dave Marcus is another good one. Dave Marcus, up until here several years ago, before they instituted, you have to wear the insulated fire shoes, and so forth when you got in the car. Dave Marcus was driving in wingtip shoes, regular wingtip leather shoes. And so here he had a fire suit on, regular wingtip shoes. And it was like, they asked him, they said, why did you do that? Why do you wear those shoes? And he says, hey, they're comfortable. They take the heat. I don't have to worry about them too much. And I mean, you race with what you've got. That's the way these Midwesterners have always been about, I think, their racing. It's like, take everything you've got with it, put it together. And that's what they did with Iowa, I think, more than anything else. They did this with Iowa. And I was just pleased that they got so much coverage. And you mentioned, yeah, this, the crowd, the Midwestern crowd out there, they had been, looking forward to this, the media coverage. It was almost like, in one way, to me, it was almost like a way of jealousy, because I was looking like, what happened? I mean, where did we go wrong in the South about promoting NASCAR and being so popular on a regular basis? Is it something that's been taken for granted? I don't know what the case may be, but still, you saw a different flair, a different kind of flavor, a different kind of, you know, down and dirty when it came to racing at Iowa than I think we've seen at other places. One thing that I'll make mention of, the track. You had paving, some new paving that had been on part of the track, and then you had the track that had been there probably, I guess, since they had paved it the first time around when they made Iowa ready for racing in the first place. Christopher Bell wasn't happy about it. Some of the drivers were not happy about that two-tone color and also the way that the thing was. He said, go ahead and pave the rest of it. And he said, he'll cure out in about 15 years and we'll be able to come back here and run some races. And I'm like, that's the whole point of you being adaptable to your driving surroundings. If you get on a track, you've got to be able to adjust. And that's what a lot of these Midwest drivers have done over time. They've adjusted. They've been able to adapt and adjust. And I think that's what's made them unique in the racing world.
Ryan Blaney, his mother is an Iowa native, so he's
Mm-hmm.
sort of a native son there.
Yep.
I read that he had 80 friends and family at the race among the sellout crowd of 40,000. So it's almost like he helped sell the thing out himself, which is
Yep.
great for the local fans there. Um, but I made the joke about he had plenty of gas, but the
Mm-hmm.
concern he led a lot of this race. I think 201 laps when he led of
Yeah.
this race.
Mm-hmm.
But he retook the lead late. His crew made the decision. Crew chief made the decision to take two tires instead of four, and so they weren't concerned about the fuel. They were concerned about the tires. Interesting
Yeah.
strategy there.
Yeah, and tire wear had been a thing going into this race because I think during some of the practice sessions or getting ready for the track on Friday, they found out that the tire, some way, somehow, the tire was not adapting or not adjusting to the track like it should have been. And so I think when that happened, they started worrying, hey, we're going to have ourselves another, uh, you know, mess up here like what we had at Bristol with tires, eating up and everything before it's over with. But they were able to adjust and fix that. But yeah, that was a gutsy call for two tires, I think, right there in the latter stages of the race. But Ryan Blaney knew his car. I think he knew what his car was capable of, sticking to the surface and being able to hold on there. But there were a lot of drivers that went in and got four tires, and they were so squirrely coming out of the turns. I mean, they had almost like wore their tires out. And I think Ryan Blaney had used his tires the way that he needed to in order to pick up this win.
So Blaney was first. He outdueled William Byron, zero point 0.7 seconds, so not really outdueled, but they were having to get through some lap traffic late. That helped a little bit too. Byron was second, Chase Elliott third, Christopher Bell fourth, Ricky Stenhouse Jr. Not having to fight after a race. He came in fifth. Talk about those other guys in the top five in their days.
Well, for Stenhouse, probably more than anything else, a big shot in the arm for him after such a terrible race. And then, of course, getting into it with Kyle Busch which we're going to talk about Kyle Busch here a little bit later. I don't know if you've been seeing the headlines about it, but there's people, conspiracy theories are already starting about Kyle, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. But Stenhouse put together one of his best rides, I think, this season, and being able to consistently be toward the top of the pack and be there and finish in fifth place. It was one of his best finishes he had in the last 3 or 4 races, I think, is what he had. Christopher Bell, he ran well, but at the same time, he complained about the track. He didn't think that the track was all that well. He said, like I mentioned earlier, he said, let's go back and let's pave the top part of it. Denny Hamlin kind of was the same way, but Christopher Bell said, let's pave the top part of it. And he said, we'll come back in about 15 years once it's cured out. But excuse me, just on the second, though, I was thinking about Denny Hamlin. Denny Hamlin said that more than anything else, he said, we need to have that top groove paved. And he said, then we'd see a lot more close side-by-side racing and a lot more vying for speed up on the high banks on the higher part of the track. And I agree with him. You probably would have seen that. It would have been a much more fresher surface for them to be able to stick to. And I think it would have been good for him. But going down the list here, looking at him, Joey Logano finished in 6th, which I thought was a good finish for Team Penske, considering Ryan Blaney won the race. But then here's another one. Josh Berry coming in at 7th, driving for Stewart-Haas Racing that's shutting down at the end of the year. Alex Bowman in 8th for Hendrick. Daniel Suarez with his first top 10, I think, this season as he finishes in 9th. And then Brad Keselowski finishes in the 10th spot. But what's interesting about the Josh Berry and Chase Briscoe situation that's going on at Stewart-Haas Racing, Josh Berry was asked over the weekend, what are you going to do? What kind of, what are you hoping that's going to be out of this whole thing this weekend at Iowa? He said, we're racing for our jobs. We're racing for our future is what we're trying to do. And Josh Berry certainly demonstrated, hey, he's no flash in the pan. He has been consistent here in the last several races. He has ran at the front, near the front, and has really stepped up for this program. But it's almost like the rest of the teams just haven't had the opportunity to step up and meet where Josh Berry has paced Stewart-Haas Racing.
So you mentioned Kyle Busch. We might as well go in that direction now. And it's
Yeah.
in the context of also news from this past week. Martin Truex Jr. announcing that this will be his last
Right.
season. He'll retire at the end of 2024. So in that context, reporters were asking Kyle Busch about his future. He's got a deal with Richard Childress for 2 years. The options for 2025. It's not known for sure whether the option is his or the owner's. In fact, was reading the Daytona Beach News Journal. The writer there says he assumes the option belongs to the owner. So
Mm-hmm.
that would keep Kyle there, whether he wants to be or not for 2025, unless I have a sense that Kyle Busch could probably raise enough of stink to maybe get himself out of a contract he's ironclad in. If
Oh, yeah.
Kyle Busch is known to be good at that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But so yeah, so I mean, so Truex retiring, and then now Kyle Busch is just throwing everything out there as far as what he will be doing next year.
That's the reason why they call it silly season, because nobody knows what's going to be happening by the time that we get even 3/4 of the way through this season. Nobody's going to know what's going on. Case in point here, Martin Truex Jr., he says it's time. And, I would say that probably there are some fans that probably said maybe a year or two ago, Martin, it was time. It was time to probably, start thinking about maybe getting out of the sport. But when Kyle Busch mentions the fact of, hey, who knows? I might go back to Joe Gibbs Racing. That's when my eyeballs just
Yeah.
suddenly just came out, because I was like, are you serious? You left there in such a huff over all this stuff. I can't see you going back. And then the second thing that caught my attention was, well, I'd entertain the overtures of Hendrick if that's where they want me back. And now it seems like it's not as much Joe Gibbs Racing as much as it might be, who knows, him racing maybe to finish up his career going back to Hendrick before it's over with. I mean, that's a possibility because, he started out running for Hendrick in the 5 car there, the one that Kyle Larson's driving now. And, it kind of opens the door back up for him to kind of come back. And we see a much more mature driver in him. And, yeah, you know, at some of these races, last year or 2 years ago, we would have seen him foaming at the mouth. He'd been ready to punch somebody in the face, and he wouldn't have cared at all about getting penalized for it or anything like that. But he's more diplomatic than he has been. I don't know if it's just been something Richard Childress has told him, or he knows in order for me to be even more accepted, I'm going to have to be diplomatic about the way that I point fingers and I do things to people. So, I mean, that may be it. I don't know. Will he go back to Joe Gibbs? I doubt it. I've got my doubts about it. That I think that the bridges have been burned back to Joe Gibbs Racing, but I could be surprised out of it. The thing is, what happens? Who do we lose out of this whole thing at Hendrick Motorsports if there's an opening? Okay. Now, the opening is the only one I'm thinking of right now is Alex Bowman, because William Byron has signed an extension. Chase Elliott's got an extension. I think Kyle Larson's got another extension too. I think Bowman is the only one right now that is kind of waiting there. I think he has this year, but he's quietly been doing things. He's not been driving terrible this season, but he's just hasn't racked up the wins. I don't know where he goes if something like this happens. He might go over to a Richard Childress Racing. You don't know where he might end up. But, a lot of questions came up this past weekend when Martin Truex threw that out at people and said, hey, it's time. It's time to go ahead and step back from this.
Yeah, that the Truex news is what throws me off a little bit. I
Mm-hmm.
look at his age. I had to make sure how old he's. 40. He'll be 44 here in a couple weeks. Let's go
Right.
ahead and say he's 44. Turns at the end of the month. 19 years in NASCAR.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, God, I don't know. Maybe, I mean, the money is what it is. The money's better than it was a generation or two ago. But guys used to race a lot longer into their lifetimes than they do now. I guess it's not, and it's not out of the context of what we've seen from guys like Jeff Gordon, Dale Earnhardt Jr., Jimmy Johnson, to either retire or semi-retire in their early to mid 40s because
Mm-hmm.
of the grind and everything else. In fact, that's what Martin Truex Jr. talked about. The crazy schedule
Yeah.
is what made him decide, hey, I need to step back from this.
I mean, you're a racer for what, 39, 38 weeks, somewhere in that neighborhood, 36 races. Each weekend you very seldom ever get a 2 week break, or you may get a 1 week break out of it. IndyCar gets maybe a couple of weeks at a time, or maybe a month off before they come back and they race again. Um, you know, I agree with him. I mean, this is stuff that has been very troublesome and tense for him, I guess, as the years have gone on, because he has I know he's moved on from Sherry Pollux, who passed away here just recently and stuff, but during the middle of his career, this part of his career, she was there with him side by side, and he was with her through the cancer diagnosis and so forth, and they had kind of moved on and moved to separate ways. And I don't know if it was really he was the same after that. I don't know if he's been the same or not. And it's kind of like, maybe I could have taken some time and spent a little bit more time with Sherry or something in this whole situation. I don't know. It's I can see where that grind gets you, because you probably have experienced it enough when you've gone to the tournaments, the World Series, and things like that. The grind gets you after a while when you have to go, and then the sudden schedule, and they shift like at NHRA with what they did to us that weekend, shift everything back a couple of hours to where we could go and get it in before the rain started. Uh, you know, Changing up your schedule, whatever time you're going to have to get up and get ready. I think I heard Ron Capps or Clay Millican actually at the NHRA race. And he's not one to criticize and stuff, but he said, hey, I'm going to have to get up at 3 a.m. just to get my car ready and just to get things ready and stuff till we can be ready to roll off and get started. And then there's the promotional things. There's all the things that you have to do for sponsors. It goes much further than what it used to even 30 years ago. I mean, it used to be maybe 3 days or 4 days before actually having racing action. You would show up in town and you maybe do a little thing of, stop by the Piggly Wiggly and see the, such and such car and, get your autograph cards and things like that. It's much more intense now. It's much more intense than what it was 30 or 40 years ago for this sport. And I think the drivers are starting to feel that more, and even more so with this thing of the impending charter negotiations and what they're running into at this point. There's a lot of uncertainty out there for a lot of these drivers, I think.
I'm looking at his career stats. You mentioned, maybe a decline and maybe some burnout there. You can kind of see it in the stats.
Mm-hmm.
2017, he won the championship. From 2017 to 2021, his finishes were overall season finishes were 1-2-2-7-2. That's a rather impressive
Yep.
set of season finishes. His last 3 years, though, 17th, missed the playoffs in 2022, and 11th last year. He's in 11th place this year. Um, so yeah, I mean, those are still great. He's still, I mean, he
Mm-hmm.
just missed. He was the first guy out of the playoffs in 2022. He made the playoffs, got knocked out relatively early in 2023, and he's in playoff contention this year. But still, yeah, I mean, when you have that stretch he had from 2017 to 2021, um, I mean, there's a lot of demand, not just on the track too. When you're a champion and then you're in contention, 3 second place finishes in the series
Mm-hmm.
2018, 2019, 2021. Um, I mean, not only are you doing what you're doing in the garage and on the track, but there's a lot of media obligations. There's a
Yep.
lot of, business and et cetera kind of obligations. And so, I mean, maybe that adds up to it as well.
Yeah, it does. It all adds up to it. And and we still been talking off and on about this whole thing with the charter, with
Yeah.
NASCAR and the charter and stuff. And news has it this past week that it's almost at a dead standstill. It's not moving. NASCAR has thrown out permanent charters. And I think some of the responses from some of the drivers is like, well, sure, there ought to be permanent charters in there and stuff, but you shouldn't charge them for it. Shouldn't go and put this much money out for them, especially after these teams have done so much for you in this sport. And talking about the Hendricks, talking about the Joe Gibbs and on down the line. Um, it's that money grab. It's that big money grab, I think, more than in these drivers, once it used to be broken down, I think the drivers did get a good chunk of their money used to at one time. They used to get a good chunk of money, and that's not a whole lot, but they would get it when they won the race. But now it has to go for all the other operational things. And then where a driver makes his money is through endorsements and also through, being there, showing up at different things like that, ads, different things. We talk about this coaching thing. We talk about Tony Bennett now finally has signed this contract extension, and Brian O'Connor at UVA signing one too. Um, there's a lot to it. There's a lot to it. And we take it for granted. I think that sometimes that you've got these coaches, and especially in this case, these drivers who, yes, give up so much of their life, even though they may treat the whole thing as that's a part of the family, but they're giving up time. They're giving up time of being with their family. Kevin Harvick, I think, wanted to see his young son be able to hit the circuit and drive. And matter of fact, I watched Keelan race and win this past Saturday a race. And, he was talking about this is the first time in something like 22 years that he's been able to sit at home and watch a race on television. That's what freaked me out. I mean, the season was over with for him because Fox has kind of moved out now and NBC has taken over. But it's different being home. And I think Kyle Busch is looking at that. He's got his young son and stuff, and he's involved in Bandolero driving, I think is what he's driving in. And they want to see these kids. They want to see their kids grow up. But the only way in order for them to have some kind of almost for kind of like a relationship with them is to kind of get them steered in some sort of direction that goes along the line of racing in order for them to be able to use their expertise, be with them, and still, be a part of their life. It doesn't work that way for all the drivers. I mean, the kids go in different directions. You're not going to see every little pigtailed Emily Jane from so-and-so's team say, I want to be a race car driver, because we will see before it's over with that looks are one thing, but driving ability is another in this sport. And I think we're finding that out with some people right now. Hallie Deegan is one of them. She's been up and down on the circuit this year. We could even go back and talk about Danica Patrick too. Danica Patrick, not all she was cracked up to be. I don't think. I wanted to honestly give her a chance, but I just don't think she had it in her. I just don't think she had the capability of driving a stock car, what it all meant, and so forth. And here's another person. There she was, tied in with all these different obligations, and really her obligation with that Nature's Bakery sponsorship that they had, and something happened where it was reneged upon somewhere, is the first signal of the downfall of Stewart-Haas Racing. When they lost that Nature's Bakery sponsorship that she was supposed to have that year, and they ended up losing it, and then it fell kind of like dominoes, because then what happened? Busch, right after that, Busch goes to none other than Ross Chastain. It's all kind of just fell apart slowly at the hands of Stewart-Haas. So we're back to that same thing again. Money, revenue, money is what it is.
And I can't imagine how hard it is to find the sponsors that you find and keep and maintain.
Yep.
Because I mean, we talked a week or two ago about how much it costs to run one of these teams.
Mm-hmm.
It's something like $100 million to run a year to run a really competitive car.
Right.
And so, and most of that money comes from sponsor dollars. It's between 60 and 80% of that comes from sponsor dollars. And so,
Right.
um, you got to convince those sponsors that they're getting. I mean, that's when you cobble together all those decals on a car and everything else, you cobble that together, and you gotta they got to get bang for the buck. They're not just putting
Yep.
their name on there to be nice. They want to get some value back from that, and I just can't imagine. I mean, so it's not just
Right.
racing every weekend and making
Right.
sure the car's ready to go and having it on the track and all the strategy and everything else and the skill of a driver. It's a year-round thing,
Mm-hmm.
just to keep the whole operation going and as we've been talking about the charter thing the last few weeks on the show.
Mm-hmm.
You do all this work and most teams still lose money. I
Yep.
just I don't see how that all works.
Well, I learned probably about 20 years ago, 20, 25 years ago. Um, it's kind of like the old saying my dad used to say it at sometimes. He says, well, you're just pouring money down a rat hole. I don't know if you've ever heard that saying before, but there it is. You pouring money down a rat hole. Um, Here my dad kind of referred to it, and I kind of didn't understand what he was talking about. But then when it came time for Bristol, and you're going to have Bristol track and so forth, you had these guys coming in that were stars on the circuit and so forth, coming in, and they were needing sponsorship. Some of these guys need sponsorship as they come into Bristol, and they've got somebody on their car, or they've got somebody on their rear quarter panel, or whatever it is, but they're always looking for somebody. And then you had a grocery chain in this area at that time that went, and I can remember they went, I think, gosh, it was something like 15 or $20,000, something like that, what they had, and they popped it down. Maybe a little bit more than that. It should have probably been maybe in the neighborhood about 10, 15,000. But they popped down sponsorship on this car, not knowing who the driver was, not really caring about who the driver was, because they wanted to be a part of the racing scene. And they were hoping that somebody, if they talk about them during the night and stuff, they didn't hope, or they didn't figure out of it all being that it was going to be, their car was going to be behind the wall for the rest of the night after a lap 12 wreck or whatever the case may be. It's one of those things that you take a risk with. And that's what some of these sponsors are finding out too. And the sponsors are, I think, they're almost demanding more and more control over the drivers, to say the least. I think is what they're trying to do. Um, Case in point, we'll see it this weekend when they go to New Hampshire. Brad Keselowski's car, the sixth car, it's going to look like it's going to look like a Boston Red Sox. That's what it's going to look like when it rolls out on the track this weekend in New Hampshire. But that's only satisfying the Fenway group. That's satisfying them and getting their name out in the New England. And I'm sure people in New England and northern part of the United States knows very well who the Boston Red Sox are, but it's just their way of being able to go out there and tell everybody, hey, here we are and stuff. Um, we feel like it's an easy solution almost. We can sit here and you and I could toss things out at each other and just talk about why can't they do this? But the solution's not as easy as it's talked about, or at least conversed among some of these people. Because if you sort of like the little Dutch boy that would go and stick his finger into the dike, stop the water from coming out, and then three more pop out, what do you got to do? You got to try to go and prevent that from flooding before it's over with and breaking loose. That's sort of the way this NASCAR charter has been. If you're able to go and seal one spot off, three or four more open up in different places. And it's something that's not been talked about, but it's now down to the line.
It's like almost like we know now how
Mhm.
hard the business is to run because more team owners, drivers, etc., are willing to talk about it.
Mhm.
It does scare me a little bit as a NASCAR fan because I see just how much of a house of cards this business is. But at the same time, it's not like this is anything new for those on the inside. NASCAR's always been operating on this shoestring from the team perspective
Yep.
since its founding,
Yeah.
75 years ago. So um it's there. It's not an easy business to be in, but there's still plenty of people who want to be in it.
Yeah, that's it. And you got people that want to be in it, and you've got people that think, well, I can do it. All I've got to do is just have all these things lined up in one place and I'm ready to go. No, you've got to go through all this other stuff. And now it's made even more complicated, I think, by this next generation car. Everything has to be, Kyle Busch put it this way over the weekend. I think when he ended up having to go behind the wall and got a DNF out of it, didn't finish the race up and everything at Iowa, I think is what ended up happening with him. He talked about this thing and he said it as nice as he could. He said, all these parts, it's kind of making me wonder who's getting the parts and where all the parts are coming from, because he said all the parts are supposed to be the same, all the parts are supposed to be built similar, but he says, why is it that most of the parts are given up on us or given up on somebody else out of it? And I'm like, he's got a point. He's got a point out of this. And all these parts are supposed to be good parts. They're supposed to be quality parts made by quote unquote NASCAR and whoever the team that is building the prototype stuff for Chevrolet, for Ford, or for Toyota. But yet they get it. And then within just, I don't know, gosh, just a few laps or something gets through there and then water pump goes down. So you're kind of left wondering what in the heck is going on with this. So I don't know. The questions, keep on popping forth like a bang a gopher, whatever you're going to do of knocking a gopher out or something like that, knock a mole or whatever you call it. But just when you think you've got one down, here's about three or four pop up, and then it's like, yeah, let's look at this and talk about it. It's just hard to believe sometimes.
Well, you mentioned that the New Hampshire race this weekend, set Sunday at 2:30 Eastern time. I'm still getting used to, Rod, I was only in the Central Time Zone for like 4 or 5 days. Um, when I was there, it always seemed way later than it was.
Oh yeah,
Now that I'm back on the East Coast, it's only 1 hour, but now
yeah.
everything seems like it's so much. So the 1 hour threw me off and it's still throwing me off. Like anyway, so but 2:30 Eastern time in New Hampshire on Sunday. We'll have coverage of the race, and of course, Rod and I will get back next week to talk more. So, well, Rod, as always, thank you for your time and your insight. Look forward to talking again next week.
Appreciate it, Chris. Thank you.